There is a peculiar kind of idea that does not announce itself as revolutionary at first, that does not arrive with the force of contradiction or the urgency of argument, but instead settles quietly into the mind and begins, almost imperceptibly, to rearrange the assumptions that were already there. And it is precisely this kind of idea that Julian Jaynes introduces when he asks a question so deceptively simple that it can pass by unnoticed, if not given the space to unfold fully, which is the question of when consciousness itself, not intelligence or perception or emotion, but consciousness in the specific sense of an inner, narrating awareness, actually appeared in human history, and why. Once that question is taken seriously, so many of the things we assume to be permanent features of the human condition begin to feel unexpectedly recent, almost provisional, as though they had been added later to a system that once functioned very differently. And as this question begins to expand, it carries with it a subtle but persistent implication, which is that the sense of being an I, the internal presence that seems to observe, to comment, to remember itself across time, may not be something that has always existed in the minds of human beings, but may instead be something that developed gradually, something constructed, something learned. And this suggestion alone, once it is allowed to fully articulate itself in the mind, begins to produce a kind of conceptual shift, because it requires us to imagine a form of human life that is outwardly as capable and organized as our own, yet inwardly lacking the very thing we tend to equate with being human at all. As Jaynes begins to examine this possibility more closely, he does so not by denying the remarkable abilities of the human brain, but by carefully separating those abilities from the specific phenomenon of consciousness, showing in a methodical and almost disarming way that perception, learning, problem-solving, language, and even complex decision-making can all occur without the presence of an internal observer, and that much of what we do in our own lives, from navigating familiar environments to engaging in extended conversations, unfolds with little or no involvement from the narrating I that we so often imagine to be in control. And once this distinction becomes clear, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the assumption that consciousness is the central or governing feature of the mind, rather than a more limited and specialized function that operates intermittently and under particular conditions. This leads naturally into a more detailed examination of what consciousness actually consists of. And here, Jaynes introduces the idea that it is not a thing in the conventional sense, not a substance or a location within the brain, but a kind of learned operation, one that depends heavily on language and metaphor, and which constructs what might be described as an analog space, a mental environment in which an analog I can move, reflect, and imagine possibilities. And it is within this constructed space that we experience ourselves as continuous beings, capable of narrating our own existence, projecting ourselves into the future, and revisiting the past. Yet this entire structure, once understood in these terms, begins to feel less like an inherent feature of cognition and more like a cultural development, something that had to be invented and refined over time. At this point, the argument takes a turn that is both unexpected and, in a certain sense, deeply clarifying, as Jaynes directs our attention to one of the oldest and most influential texts in Western literature, the Iliad, and suggests that it can be read not only as a work of poetry or mythology, but as a kind of psychological document, a record of how human beings experience their own minds at a particular moment in history. And when we begin to look at it in this way, a striking pattern emerges, one that is difficult to ignore once it has been noticed, which is the near total absence of anything resembling introspection, of any moment in which a character steps back from action to consider their own thoughts or motivations in the way that we would consider natural or even unavoidable. Instead, what we find in scene after scene is a very different structure of experience in which moments of decision are not accompanied by internal deliberation, but by the sudden appearance of external voices, identified as gods who issue clear and direct commands that are immediately acted upon. And these voices are not treated as metaphors or symbolic representations, but as real, authoritative presences, as any physical action. And the consistency with which this pattern appears throughout the text begins to suggest that it may reflect not simply a literary convention, but an underlying mode of cognition, one in which the guidance that we now experience as internal thought was instead perceived as originating from outside the self. From this observation, Jaynes develops the central concept of the bicameral mind, proposing that the human brain once operated in a functionally divided manner, with one chamber responsible for generating verbal commands under conditions of stress or uncertainty, and the other responsible for receiving and executing those commands without question. And while this may initially sound speculative, he supports it by drawing on neurological evidence, including studies of hemispheric specialization and split brain patients, which demonstrate that the brain is capable, even in its modern form, of producing experiences in which one part generates information that another part receives without full awareness of its origin. And when this capacity is considered in the context of ancient societies, it becomes possible to imagine a stable and widely shared form of experience in which such internally generated commands were consistently interpreted as external voices. What makes this hypothesis particularly compelling is not only that it accounts for the textual evidence, but that it also provides a functional explanation for the organization of early civilizations, which faced the challenge of coordinating large populations in the absence of established institutions or widespread literacy. And in this context, the presence of authoritative, unquestioned voices would have provided a powerful mechanism for maintaining order, directing labor, and reinforcing social hierarchies, effectively serving as a kind of distributed control system that allowed complex societies to function without the need for individual conscious deliberation at every level. As this framework begins to take shape, it becomes increasingly clear that what we think of as gods in the ancient world may have played a role that is far more immediate and practical than is usually assumed, not merely as objects of belief or ritual, but as active participants in the cognitive processes of the people who experienced them, guiding actions, resolving uncertainties, and providing a source of certainty in situations where, in the absence of consciousness, no internal mechanism for such resolution existed. At the same time, Jaynes is careful to note that the neurological structures underlying this mode of cognition have not disappeared, and that even in contemporary individuals, under certain conditions, such as extreme stress, hypnosis, or particular psychiatric states, similar experiences can occur, suggesting that the capacity for bicameral-like processing remains embedded within the brain, not as a dominant mode, but as a latent potential, one that can still be activated under the right circumstances. By the time this first section reaches its conclusion, the cumulative effect of these ideas is not so much to provide a definitive answer as to create a new way of seeing, a shift in perspective that makes it possible to consider the history of the human mind as a process of development rather than a fixed condition, and to recognize that the inner voice we experience as our own may be the result of a relatively recent transformation, one that emerged in response to changing social and environmental pressures, and which continues to shape the way we understand ourselves and our place in the world. And once this perspective has been established, even tentatively, it becomes difficult to return entirely to the previous assumption that consciousness is an unchanging given, because the idea that it might have been different, that it might have been absent, or that it might one day change again, introduces a kind of conceptual openness, a willingness to reconsider not only the past, but the present, and to notice, perhaps for the first time, that the voice through which these ideas are being understood has a structure, a history, and a set of conditions that made it possible, and that understanding those conditions may be the beginning of understanding the mind itself. Hello, and welcome to this quiet exploration of one of the most startling ideas ever put forward about the human mind. Julian Jaynes begins his book with a simple preface, almost as if he is speaking directly to you across decades, confessing that what he is about to unfold is not just another theory, but a complete reorientation of how we understand ourselves. He tells us he has spent years chasing a single question that refuses to let him go. When did consciousness actually appear in human history? And why does everything we take for granted about our inner lives suddenly look so fragile and recent once we ask that question properly? He lays out the structure of the work ahead with the care of someone who knows he is walking on revolutionary ground, promising that by the end we will see our own minds differently, not as eternal fixtures, but as something invented, something learned, something that arrived long after civilization itself. And already, before we have even properly begun, the introduction opens like a door we did not know was there. Jaynes invites us to look at consciousness, not as some ancient biological endowment handed down from our evolutionary past, but as a cultural invention, surprisingly late in arriving, perhaps only 3,000 years old. He draws a calm, precise line between consciousness and all the other remarkable things the brain does without it. Perceiving the world, learning skills, solving problems, feeling emotions, even making decisions. None of those, he shows us, actually require the special inner theater we call consciousness. We have spent centuries assuming the mind has always worked the way it does for us today. Yet, Jaynes asks us, gently but relentlessly, to consider that this assumption may be the greatest illusion of all. What we experience as the private, narrating I inside our heads is not a natural given. It is a learned analog space built from language and metaphor, a space that allows us to see ourselves as objects in our own mental stories. And once you see that, once you really feel how recent and constructed it is, the entire landscape of human history begins to shift beneath your feet. From there, we step into the first book, The Mind of Man, and the ideas begin to unfold in layers, each one deepening the last. In the opening chapter, Jaynes asks us to examine our own consciousness of consciousness, to notice how much of what we do every single day happens without any inner observer watching. Walking down a street, driving a car, carrying on a conversation, even solving a complex problem in the background of our thoughts. None of these require the spotlight of awareness we usually imagine must be present. He dismantles the assumption that consciousness is vast and all-encompassing, showing instead that it is narrow, intermittent, and far less necessary than we have been taught. Most mental life, he argues, proceeds perfectly well in the dark, and this realization alone is enough to make the ground feel unsteady, because it means the I we cherish is not the ruler of the mind, but something more like a late arriving guest. Then, in the chapter simply titled Consciousness, the idea grows even more profound. Jaynes walks us slowly through what consciousness actually is. Not a thing, not a substance, but an operation, a learned habit of creating an analog I that moves through an analog space of time and possibility. We narratize our lives, we spatialize our thoughts, we metaphorically place ourselves inside mental pictures that never existed before. Language gave us the tools. He shows how this capacity is built on top of older, non-conscious processes, how it allows us to deceive, to plan, to remember ourselves across time, and yet how fragile and recent this whole architecture really is. The mind, he suggests, was doing astonishing work for millennia before it ever learned to watch itself doing that work. And the moment you internalize that truth, your own inner voice starts to sound different, more like a cultural inheritance than an eternal birthright. And then we are carried, almost without noticing the transition, into the world of the Iliad. Here Jaynes slows down and lets the ancient poem itself speak. He reads its lines not as literature, but as psychological evidence, and what emerges is startling. The heroes, Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, do not possess anything we would recognize as an inner life. There is no introspection, no private doubt, no moment where a character steps back and says, "I wonder what I should do." Instead, when a decision must be made, a god simply appears and speaks, clear as a voice in the ear. "Go," the voice says, or "fight," or "yield," and the hero obeys without hesitation or internal debate. Jaynes traces scene after scene, the rage of Achilles, the councils of kings, the battles on the plain, and in every case, the pattern holds. No subjective consciousness, only external auditory commands that feel as real as any physical presence. The gods are not metaphors or literary devices. In this reading, they are the actual operating system of the preconscious mind, the mechanism that made organized human life possible before the invention of the narrating self. This leads us naturally into the heart of the hypothesis, the chapter on the bicameral mind itself. Jaynes proposes that for most of human civilization, the mind was not unified in the way we experience it today. It was bicameral, two-chambered. The right hemisphere, under certain conditions of stress or authority, generated clear, hallucinatory verbal commands, and the left hemisphere, the side that handles language and action, simply listened and obeyed. These were not superstitions or poetic fancies. They were the everyday experience of ordinary people and kings alike. The voices were experienced as external, authoritative, divine. They told people when to plant, when to fight, when to build, how to govern. And because there was no competing inner I to argue or hesitate, entire civilizations rose and functioned with a kind of automatic obedience that we can scarcely imagine now. Jaynes builds the case patiently, layer by layer, showing how this arrangement solved the problem of social coordination in large agricultural societies, where face-to-face tribal cues were no longer enough. The gods were the glue, the organizing principle, the invisible bureaucracy of the ancient world. To make the idea feel even more solid, he turns next to the double brain, drawing on modern neurological evidence from split brain patients and hemispheric research. The brain, even today, can still operate in ways that echo that ancient division. One side can generate speech or command while the other listens and acts, sometimes without the speaking side even knowing why. Under hypnosis, in moments of extreme stress, or in certain altered states, the old pattern can reappear. Jaynes does not claim the bicameral mind is still the dominant mode. He simply shows that the neurological hardware for it never disappeared. It is still there, latent, capable of being reactivated. And in that realization comes a strange kind of vertigo. The voices that once governed humanity may still whisper at the edges of our experience, waiting for the right conditions to be heard again. Finally, the book closes its first section by tracing the origin of civilization itself, back to this very arrangement when small hunter-gatherer bands gave way to large settled communities. The old tribal mechanisms of social control broke down. Too many people, too much complexity, too many strangers. The bicameral mind emerged as the solution. The hallucinated voices of gods and ancestors provided a new, scalable form of authority. They coordinated labor, enforced hierarchy, maintained order without the need for constant, conscious negotiation. Jaynes shows us how this transition allowed agriculture, cities, writing, law codes, and monumental architecture to appear almost simultaneously across different regions of the world. The gods were not later inventions added to civilization. They were the operating system that made civilization possible in the first place. And yet, as he leaves us at the end of this first book, we sense the gathering pressure of change. Something is about to break. The voices are about to fall silent. Consciousness is about to be born out of necessity, out of chaos, out of the very success of the bicameral world it would eventually replace. And so the first book ends, not with answers wrapped up neatly, but with a profound sense that everything we thought we knew about being human has been quietly, rationally, and irreversibly overturned. What Jaynes has given us is not just a theory of the past. It is a new lens through which to see our own minds, our own history, and the strange, late-arriving phenomenon we call the self. The ground feels different now. The inner voice you are hearing as you listen feels different now. And that difference, that slow dawning recognition, is where the real journey begins. There comes a point, as an idea matures in the mind, when it begins to demand evidence, not in the form of argument or speculation, but in the form of something more grounded, something that can be pointed to, traced, and followed across time. And it is precisely at this point that the theory of the bicameral mind leaves behind the relatively abstract terrain of definition and mechanism and begins to move through the actual record of human history, where the fragments of ancient life, inscriptions, burial practices, poems, laws, begin to align in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like the visible imprint of a mind that once operated according to principles very different from our own. And as this alignment becomes clearer, the hypothesis that once felt daring begins to take on a kind of quiet inevitability, as though the past itself had been waiting to be read in this way. What is especially striking as this historical journey begins is how much of the evidence had always been present, cataloged, and studied and preserved with great care, yet interpreted through a framework that assumed modern consciousness as a constant. And so, when Jaynes turns our attention to the physical remnants of early civilizations, graves, idols, and the arrangement of the dead among the living, he is not introducing new data so much as asking a different question of familiar artifacts, and in so doing, revealing a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight, which is that the ancient dead were not treated as silent, departed bodies, positioned, provisioned, and in some cases, even housed in ways that suggest an expectation of continued communication, as though the boundary between life and death had not yet taken on the finality that it holds for us now. In these burial sites, where bodies are arranged upright, accompanied by tools, food, and offerings, there is an implicit assumption that something of the person remains active, capable of interaction, capable perhaps of issuing guidance. And when this is considered alongside the widespread use of idols, not as decorative symbols, but as physical loci of divine presence, it begins to seem plausible that these objects functioned as anchors for experiences that were not metaphorical but perceptual, that the voices which once guided behavior required a kind of spatial fixation, a place in the external world where they could be encountered, and that the idols, the statues, the carved figures were not representations of gods, but the very structures through which those gods were experienced. As this perspective expands, it becomes possible to see early civilizations not simply as societies with religious beliefs, but as systems organized around a particular mode of cognition, one in which authority was not internalized but encountered as external command. And it is within this context that the emergence of writing takes on a new and somewhat unexpected significance, because rather than marking the beginning of reflective thought, it appears first as a reinforcement of the existing system, a way of preserving and transmitting the words of the gods in a stable, repeatable form, allowing commands that were once heard in specific moments to be extended across time and space, and in so doing, strengthening the structure of obedience that underpinned these early theocracies. In the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where writing, architecture, and centralized authority developed in close proximity, the figure of the king becomes especially important, not as an individual exercising personal judgment, but as a conduit for divine instruction, a living interface between the voice and the population. And when we examine the law codes, the inscriptions, and the rituals of these societies, we find a consistent pattern in which authority is always traced back to an external source, to a god who speaks and a human who transmits that speech. And there is no indication of the kind of internal deliberation that would later become central to moral and political life, because the system does not require it, and indeed could not function with it. And yet, even within this apparent stability, there are forces at work that begin to introduce strain, subtle at first, but accumulating over time, as populations grow larger, as trade networks extend across greater distances, as encounters between different groups introduce new variables into a system that depends on consistent and unquestioned authority. And it is here that the theory begins to take on a dynamic quality, because the bicameral mind is no longer presented as a static condition, but as a system subject to pressure, capable of breakdown under circumstances that exceed its capacity to maintain coherence. Among these pressures, the role of writing becomes increasingly complex because, while it initially serves to reinforce the authority of the gods, it also introduces the possibility of silent reading, of encountering words without the accompanying auditory experience. And this subtle shift begins to create a space in which commands can be considered rather than simply obeyed, compared rather than immediately enacted. And in this space, however small at first, the seeds of a new kind of cognition begin to take root, one that does not rely entirely on external voices for guidance. At the same time, large-scale disruptions, natural disasters, migrations, invasions, introduce uncertainty into environments that had previously been stabilized by the regularity of divine command. And when those commands fail to appear or appear inconsistently, the system begins to falter, not all at once, but in localized and uneven ways, producing a kind of cognitive dissonance that must be resolved if individuals and societies are to continue functioning. And it is in this context that the invention of consciousness, not as a sudden emergence, but as a gradual adaptation, begins to make sense as a necessary response to the absence of reliable external guidance. This transition is perhaps most poignantly captured in the textual record of Mesopotamia, where inscriptions that once conveyed confident and direct communication from the gods begin to shift in tone, expressing uncertainty, abandonment, and a longing for the return of voices that no longer speak as they once did. And when we read phrases such as, "My God has forsaken me," not as theological statements, but as descriptions of a changed cognitive experience, they take on a different weight, suggesting not a crisis of belief, but a transformation in perception, a loss of something that had previously been as immediate and unquestioned as our own inner speech. As this loss becomes more widespread, individuals begin to develop alternative strategies for accessing guidance, including various forms of divination, ritual, and prayer, which can be understood as attempts to recreate or simulate the conditions under which voices might be heard. And while these practices vary in form and effectiveness, they share a common underlying assumption that guidance must come from outside the self, even as the capacity to generate such guidance internally begins to emerge in a new and less clearly defined way. When we turn to the Greek world, the transition becomes more visible in the evolution of literature, where texts such as the Iliad provide a baseline of fully bicameral experience, and later, works begin to introduce elements of internalization, of characters who speak not only to gods, but to themselves, who experience something like hesitation, reflection, or internal conflict. And this gradual layering of interiority can be traced through changes in language, in the metaphors used to describe thought and emotion, and in the increasing presence of words that refer to internal states rather than external commands. By the time we reach later Greek authors, including early philosophers and lawmakers, the concept of the self as an object of knowledge begins to take shape, expressed in phrases that would have been unintelligible in earlier periods. And this development suggests not only a change in vocabulary, but a change in experience. A shift from a world in which actions are guided by voices to one in which they are evaluated within an internal framework that allows for comparison, anticipation, and reflection. A similar pattern can be observed in the Hebrew texts, where the progression from direct divine speech to more mediated forms of communication parallels the broader transition from bicameral to conscious cognition. And in the earlier narratives, where the phrase, "the Lord said," appears with regularity and immediacy, the structure remains consistent with the bicameral model. While in later writings, particularly those that emphasize personal reflection and moral deliberation, we begin to see the emergence of a distinct internal voice, one that speaks not with the authority of command, but with the uncertainty of interpretation. Figures such as the prophets occupy an intermediate position in this process, experiencing voices that are no longer universal but exceptional, and whose messages must be conveyed to others who may not share the same perceptual access. And this shift introduces a new layer of complexity as the authority of the voice becomes subject to question, interpretation, and even doubt, requiring new forms of validation and new mechanisms for establishing trust within the community. By the time this transformation reaches its later stages, the fully conscious individual emerges, not as a replacement for the bicameral mind, but as a response to its breakdown, carrying forward certain structural elements, language, metaphor, narrative, while reorganizing them into a system that operates internally rather than externally. And while this system allows for greater flexibility, creativity, and self-awareness, it also introduces new challenges, including the burden of decision-making, the possibility of error, and the experience of uncertainty in the absence of clear and authoritative guidance. And so, as this second phase of the argument comes to a close, what remains is not simply a historical account, but a reconfiguration of how we understand the relationship between mind and culture, between cognition and environment, and between the individual and the structures that support or constrain their experience. Because if consciousness is indeed a product of historical conditions, then it follows that those conditions continue to shape it, and that the way we think, the way we experience ourselves, and the way we interpret the world around us are all, to some extent, contingent upon a process that is still unfolding, still adapting, and still open to change. Hello, and welcome to this next unfolding of Julian Jaynes' vision, the part of the book where the theory steps out of the abstract and begins to walk through the actual record of human history itself, where the ideas we have been turning over in our minds suddenly find their footing in stone tablets, broken pottery, epic verses, and the slow, haunting shift in the way ancient people spoke about their own experience. We enter Book 2 now, the witness of history, and the ground beneath us changes. What felt like a daring hypothesis in the first book begins to feel almost inevitable once you see the evidence laid out in this patient, almost archaeological way. Jaynes does not rush. He lets the past speak for itself, chapter by chapter, showing us how the bicameral mind was not some fleeting speculation, but the actual operating system that ran the first great civilizations. And then, under pressures, we can still recognize today how that system began to fracture and give birth to something new. It begins with gods, graves, and idols. And here Jaynes takes us into the silent testimony of the earth itself, into burial sites and figurines that most historians had simply cataloged without ever asking what they might have meant to the people who made them. He shows us graves where the dead were propped upright, surrounded by food, tools, and offerings, as though they were expected to keep speaking, to keep guiding the living, long after the body had stopped breathing. Idols were not decorations or symbols. They were literal houses for the voices, physical anchors for the hallucinatory commands that once directed daily life. Across Mesopotamia, early Egypt, even hints in distant cultures, the pattern repeats. These were not superstitious objects, but the very technology of social control, the visible presence of the gods who spoke inside people's heads. And as you sit with that image, the whole ancient world starts to feel less like a primitive version of our own, and more like a different kind of mind entirely. One where the boundary between the living and the divine, between the self and the voice, had not yet been drawn. From there, the current carries us into literate bicameral theocracies, and Jaynes slows even further, letting us watch the birth of writing, not as the beginning of records, but as the first reinforcement of the divine voice, now made permanent. In Sumer, in Babylon, in the early kingdoms along the Nile, the king was not a ruler who consulted his own judgment. He was the mouthpiece, or the very embodiment, of the god. And the law codes, the inscriptions, the temple rituals, all served to keep that auditory authority intact. Hammurabi's code is not presented as mere legislation, but as words received directly from Marduk. The pharaoh is Horus walking the earth. There is no inner debate, no personal conscience, no I weighing options. Obedience is automatic because the command arrives from outside, clear and unarguable. Jaynes lets us feel the elegance of the system. It scaled. It allowed thousands, tens of thousands, to coordinate planting cycles, canal building, military campaigns without the chaos that would come if every individual suddenly had to invent their own reasons for acting. Civilization, he implies, was not built by conscious planners. It was built by people who heard their instructions and simply followed. And yet, even while the theocracies were at their height, the seeds of disruption were already being sown. And the next chapter, The Causes of Consciousness, is where the story turns, where Jaynes begins to trace the slow accumulation of forces that the bicameral mind could no longer contain. Overpopulation, the sheer density of strangers living side by side, the complexity of long-distance trade, the constant pressure of migration and invasion. All of these stretched the old system past its limits. Writing, once a tool to reinforce the gods, now began to replace them. A written command could be read in silence, pondered, compared, and suddenly the voice was no longer the only authority. Natural disasters, the explosion of Thera that sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, the waves of Dorian invaders sweeping into Greece, the relentless expansion of empires that shattered older hierarchies. Each event chipped away at the certainty that the gods would always speak when needed. Jaynes does not present this as catastrophe in the ordinary sense, but as the necessary friction that forced the mind to invent something it had never needed before. An internal space where a person could step back, consider, narrate their own choices, and survive when the external voices fell silent. The breakdown was not failure. It was the birth pangs of the conscious I. That birth is witnessed most clearly in A Change of Mind in Mesopotamia, where Jaynes takes us into the cuneiform tablets that survive from around 1000 BCE onward and lets the voices themselves tell us they are leaving. Inscriptions that once rang with confident divine instructions now fill with lament. My God has forsaken me. The good angel who walked beside me has disappeared. Kings kneeling before empty thrones where the God used to sit and speak. The old certainty is gone. People begin to experiment with new ways of reaching the divine. Divination, prayer, ritual that feels more like pleading than simple obedience. Jaynes lingers here, letting the emotional weight of those lines settle, because this is the moment the theory becomes visceral. You can almost hear the silence where the voices used to be, and in that silence, the first faint stirrings of introspection begin to appear. The Mesopotamian mind is changing, and the change is not gentle. It is a profound disorientation that will eventually force the invention of a new way of being human. The river then carries us westward into the intellectual consciousness of Greece, and here the evidence grows richer, more literary, because the Greeks left us the very poems that document the transition in real time. Jaynes returns to the Iliad, now as the baseline, the last great monument of the fully bicameral mind, where every major decision is still handed down by Athena or Apollo or Zeus in clear auditory form. But by the time we reach the Odyssey, the texture has already shifted. Characters begin to speak of urges inside themselves, of thumos and phrenes, words that will slowly evolve into our modern vocabulary of mind and emotion. Hesiod, the lyric poets, the first philosophers. Each generation adds another layer of interiority. By the time of Solon in Athens, the command, "Know thyself," can be uttered and understood in a way that would have been literally unthinkable to the heroes at Troy. Jaynes traces the linguistic evolution almost like a detective following footprints. The metaphors of space and vision and inner dialogue multiply, and suddenly the Greek mind is no longer simply obeying. It is watching itself obey, questioning, remembering, planning. Consciousness is not discovered, it is being built, line by line, poem by poem. Finally, In the moral consciousness of the Kabiru, Jaynes turns to the Hebrews, to the Old Testament itself, as the longest continuous record of the breakdown and the slow, painful birth of the conscious self. In the earlier books, the pattern is still bicameral. And the Lord said unto Moses, direct, unmediated, no inner commentary. By the time of Amos, around 800 BCE, the voice is still strong, but already beginning to feel like prophecy rather than everyday guidance. Then Saul appears, the first fully conscious figure in this tradition, a man who can lie, who can doubt, who can no longer reliably hear the divine command, and must live with the terrifying freedom that follows. Later books, Ecclesiastes above all, are saturated with the subjective I said to myself. I considered in my heart, a mind that has learned to narrate its own moral struggles, its own doubts, its own search for meaning in a world where the gods no longer speak on demand. Jaynes shows us the prophets not as anomalies, but as the bridge, men whose hallucinations are now the exception rather than the rule, and whose messages must be interpreted by a newly conscious audience, struggling to make sense of right and wrong without external dictation. And so Book 2 draws to its close, leaving us standing on the far side of a transformation that feels both ancient and strangely contemporary. The bicameral mind, which had organized the first cities and empires with such effortless authority, has fallen silent under the weight of its own success, and in its place, something quieter, more solitary, more anxious has emerged. The conscious human being, capable of doubt, of deceit, of planning, of moral reflection, but forever cut off from the certain guidance that once made life simple. Jaynes has not merely described history, he has rewritten the plot, showing us that what we call the self is not the starting point of civilization, but its unforeseen consequence. The voices are gone, yet their echo remains. In every moment we pause and ask ourselves what we should do next. And in that pause, in that new inner space we have inherited, the real story of who we are continues to unfold. There is a particular kind of realization that does not arrive as a new idea, so much as a reversal of distance, a moment in which something that had been comfortably placed in the past, examined as history and understood as no longer relevant, begins to move closer. Not abruptly, but gradually, until it is no longer clear whether it belongs to another time at all. And it is precisely this movement that defines the final stage of Jaynes's argument, where the bicameral mind, having been traced through ancient graves and tablets and the slow transformation of language, now reveals itself not as an extinct structure, but as a continuing presence, something that has not disappeared so much as been layered over, redirected, and absorbed into the functioning of the modern mind in ways that are subtle, persistent, and often unnoticed unless one begins to look for them with a certain kind of attentiveness. What becomes apparent almost immediately once this shift in perspective is allowed to take hold is that the need for guidance, for certainty, for some form of authorization that does not originate entirely within the self, has not diminished with the emergence of consciousness, but has instead taken on new forms, adapting itself to the structures of culture, belief, and social organization that have developed in the absence of direct auditory command. And so, when we observe the enduring power of religion, of political authority, of systems that promise clarity and direction, it becomes possible to interpret these not simply as products of tradition or persuasion, but as expressions of a deeper cognitive tendency, a residual expectation that decisions should be confirmed, validated, or even dictated by a source that stands outside the fluctuating and often uncertain space of individual thought. This tendency, once noticed, begins to appear in places that might otherwise seem unrelated, in the way individuals defer to experts, in the way groups organize themselves around shared narratives, in the way certain ideas acquire a kind of unquestioned authority that resists internal critique. And while it would be inaccurate to reduce all of these phenomena to a single origin, it is nevertheless striking how consistently they reflect a structure in which the burden of decision is eased by the presence, whether real or constructed, of an external voice that carries more weight than one's own internal deliberation. And in this sense, the modern world can be understood not as having replaced the bicameral mind, but as having reconfigured it, distributing its functions across institutions, symbols, and collective agreements. When Jaynes turns to the phenomenon of prophecy and possession, this continuity becomes even more explicit, because here, the boundary between past and present begins to blur in a way that is difficult to ignore. As individuals in various cultural and psychological contexts report experiences that closely resemble the auditory commands described in ancient texts, not as metaphors or imaginative constructs, but as vivid, externalized voices that issue instructions, provide information, or assert authority in a manner that bypasses the usual processes of conscious reflection. And while such experiences are often categorized as exceptional or pathological within modern frameworks, Jaynes invites us to consider them instead as direct expressions of a capacity that once operated universally, now appearing in more limited and context-dependent forms. This perspective gains further depth when we consider the role of artistic creation, particularly in poetry and music, where the experience of inspiration is frequently described in terms that echo the language of external guidance, as though the creative act were less a matter of deliberate construction and more a process of receiving, of allowing something to pass through the individual, rather than being generated entirely by them. And while it is possible to interpret this in purely psychological terms as a function of unconscious processing, the consistency of the metaphor across cultures and historical periods suggests that it may also reflect a deeper structural continuity, a vestige of the bicameral arrangement in which the generation of language and the execution of language were experienced as distinct and sometimes separate processes. In the case of hypnosis, the connection becomes even more concrete, because here we have a controlled setting in which the usual dominance of the conscious I can be temporarily reduced, allowing external suggestions to be received and acted upon with a degree of immediacy and compliance that closely parallels the behavior described in bicameral contexts. And what is particularly noteworthy is not simply that individuals can enter such a state, but that the capacity to do so appears to be widespread, suggesting that the underlying mechanisms required for this mode of operation remain intact within the modern brain, even if they are no longer the default mode of functioning. This continuity takes on a more complex and challenging form in the discussion of schizophrenia, where the reappearance of auditory hallucinations, often in the form of commanding voices, presents a phenomenon that is difficult to reconcile within a purely modern framework of cognition, yet becomes more comprehensible when viewed as a partial reactivation of bicameral processes, in which the distinction between internally generated and externally perceived language is altered in a way that resembles, at least in certain structural respects, the earlier organization of the mind. And while this does not diminish the seriousness of the condition or the suffering it can entail, it does provide a context in which the experiences reported by patients can be understood as variations on a historically grounded pattern, rather than as entirely anomalous disruptions. As the argument moves toward its conclusion, the focus shifts once again, this time to the broader implications of this continuity for the way we understand not only the past, but the present and the future. And it is here that the concept of authorization returns in a new form, because even in the domain of science, which is often regarded as the most rigorous and self-correcting system of knowledge, we can observe patterns in which authority is distributed across frameworks, paradigms, and communities of interpretation, creating a structure in which individual judgment is guided, constrained, and in some cases, overridden by the collective voice of the discipline. And while this is not equivalent to the direct auditory commands of the bicameral mind, it, nevertheless, reflects a similar dynamic in which certainty is located outside the individual, rather than within. What emerges from this final stage of the analysis is not a simple conclusion, but a kind of layered understanding, in which consciousness is seen not as a complete replacement for earlier forms of cognition, but as an addition, a modification that coexists with older structures that continue to influence behavior, perception, and social organization in ways that are often indirect, but nonetheless significant. And this layered model allows for a more nuanced interpretation of human experience, one that accommodates both the capacity for reflective self-awareness and the persistent tendency to seek guidance, authority, and meaning beyond the boundaries of the individual mind. And as this understanding settles into place, it becomes possible to revisit the earlier stages of the argument with a different perspective, recognizing that the transition from bicameral to conscious cognition was not a clean break, but a gradual and uneven process, one that left behind traces, tendencies, and potentials that remain active, even if they are expressed in new forms, and that the modern mind, for all its complexity and adaptability, still operates within a framework that was shaped by conditions that no longer exist in their original form, yet continue to exert influence through the structures they helped to create. In this sense, the theory does not so much redefine what it means to be human as expand it, introducing the possibility that the self we experience is only one layer of a more complex system, one that includes both the reflective, narrating consciousness that allows for planning and introspection, and the more automatic, externally oriented processes that once provided direct guidance, and that understanding this dual inheritance may offer new ways of thinking about everything from creativity and belief to mental health and social organization. And if there is a final implication to be drawn from this, it is perhaps that the story of the mind is not complete, that the structures we now take for granted may themselves be subject to change under new conditions, and that the same capacity for adaptation that gave rise to consciousness in the first place may continue to shape its development in ways that are not yet fully understood, leaving open the possibility that what we experience as the present state of the mind is not an end point, but one phase in an ongoing process, the direction of which remains, as it has always been, contingent upon the interplay between the brain, the environment, and the systems of meaning through which we interpret both. The origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Book 3 Recap. Hello, and welcome to the final movement of Julian Jaynes's extraordinary revisioning of the human mind. The part where the ancient machinery we have been tracing through graves and tablets and epic verses suddenly reveals itself as still alive inside us, not as a dead relic, but as a living undercurrent that continues to shape the way we seek guidance, create, obey, and sometimes fracture in the modern world. We enter Book 3 now, Vestiges of the Bicameral Mind in the Modern World, and the tone shifts again from the archaeological witness of history to something more intimate, more immediate, because Jaynes is no longer speaking only about the distant past. He is speaking about the faint but unmistakable echoes that still sound inside every one of us when the conscious I grows quiet or overwhelmed. What felt like a completed transformation in Book 2 now appears incomplete, unfinished, because the old two-chambered mind never entirely vanished. It lingers in the margins of culture, in the edges of psychology, in the very places where we still reach for external voices to tell us what to do when our own inner narration fails. And as these final chapters unfold, layer by layer, you begin to feel the theory close around you like a circle completing itself. Consciousness was not a clean break with the past, but a thin, new skin stretched over an older architecture that still pulses beneath. It opens with the quest for authorization. And here, Jaynes draws us into one of the most quietly unsettling observations of the entire book. Even after the voices fell silent, even after the conscious self learned to narrate its own decisions, human beings have never stopped craving an external source of certainty, an outside authority that can speak with the same unambiguous command the gods once provided. We see it in religion, in politics, in every ideology that promises to relieve us of the burden of constant self-questioning. We appoint leaders, we cling to sacred texts, we invent new divinities out of science or progress or charisma, all because the bicameral mind's deep wiring still whispers that the safest way to act is to obey a voice that is not our own. Jaynes does not judge this. He simply notices how universal it remains, how the invention of consciousness brought freedom, but also a new kind of loneliness, a hunger for authorization that the old hallucinatory system once satisfied without effort. And in that recognition, the modern world starts to look different, less like a triumph of rational autonomy, and more like a long, ongoing negotiation with an inheritance we can neither fully embrace nor fully escape. From there, the current drifts into profits, and possession, where Jaynes turns his gaze to the persistent phenomenon of people who still hear voices, who still speak in the name of something larger than themselves, and shows us that these are not aberrations, but direct descendants of the ancient bicameral experience. Prophets, mediums, those overtaken by spirits in ritual or crisis. In each case, the pattern repeats. The conscious I steps aside, and another voice, clear, authoritative, external, takes the stage. Glossolalia, the speaking in tongues, becomes a modern echo of the old divine commands. Possession states become temporary reactivations of the right hemisphere generator that once spoke to entire civilizations. Jaynes lingers on the cultural function of these episodes, how societies have always made room for them at the edges of the conscious order, as if we instinctively know that the old machinery is still available when the new one reaches its limits. And as you follow his reasoning, the line between the ancient world and our own begins to dissolve. What we call the paranormal or the pathological starts to feel like the mind remembering an older, more automatic way of being. The stream then carries us into poetry and music. And here the ideas take on an almost lyrical quality of their own, because Jaynes is tracing the same bicameral residue in the places where creativity feels least under conscious control. The poet does not sit down and rationally construct verse. The muse arrives, the words come through, the rhythm possesses the hand or the voice, as though something external is dictating. Music, especially in its most trance-inducing forms, replicates the old auditory command structure, a beat, a melody, a collective pulse that bypasses the narrating I and moves the body and mind directly. Jaynes shows us how the artist, like the ancient prophet, becomes a vessel, how inspiration has always been described in the language of external visitation, because that is how the bicameral mind actually experienced it. And suddenly, the entire history of art opens up as a bridge between the two mentalities, a place where the conscious mind willingly hands the reins back to the older architecture so that something truer, something more powerful, can speak. It is not regression. It is recognition that the full range of human potential still requires both chambers working in their ancient dialogue. Next comes hypnosis, and Jaynes approaches this most misunderstood phenomena with the same calm rationality that has guided every step so far, demonstrating that what looks like a parlor trick is actually one of the clearest experimental windows into the bicameral mind still operating inside us. Under hypnosis, the conscious I is gently set aside, and the subject obeys external commands with the same unhesitating automaticity that once characterized obedience to the gods. There is no inner debate, no skeptical narration. The voice of the hypnotist occupies the place the divine voice once held. Jaynes reviews the evidence, the susceptibility patterns, the way suggestions can alter perception and memory, exactly as the old hallucinations once did. And he leaves us with the profound implication that the capacity for this state never disappeared. It was simply relabeled and pushed to the periphery of respectable psychology. In that moment, the entire modern fascination with altered states, with surrender, with letting go, begins to feel less like novelty and more like the mind's ancient memory reasserting itself whenever the conscious burden grows too heavy. And then the current deepens into schizophrenia, the chapter that has perhaps generated the most discussion and the most unease, because Jaynes does not treat the condition as mere illness, but as the clearest, most unfiltered vestige of the bicameral mind, still functioning in the present. The auditory hallucinations reported by many schizophrenic patients are not random noise. They are structured, often commanding, often experienced as external and authoritative, exactly as the gods once spoke to the heroes of the Iliad. Jaynes traces the parallels with meticulous care, the stress triggers, the cultural shaping of the voices, the way the conscious I struggles to reassert itself against commands that feel older and more powerful. He is not romanticizing the suffering. He is offering a new framework that makes the symptoms comprehensible rather than incomprehensible. A framework in which schizophrenia appears less as a breakdown of the modern mind and more as a partial reversion to the older, pre-conscious organization. And in that reframing comes a strange compassion. The voices are not invading a healthy mind. They are the mind remembering its original architecture when the newer one falters. Finally, in the auguries of science, Jaynes brings the entire journey to a reflective close, stepping back from the details to consider what this new understanding means for the future we are still inventing. Science itself, he suggests, is the latest and perhaps most powerful attempt to find authorization outside the fragile, conscious self. Yet, even science carries bicameral echoes in its reliance on models, on paradigms, on the collective voice of the discipline that tells the individual researcher what to see and how to interpret. He offers no grand utopian prediction, only a clear-eyed recognition that the transition from bicameral to conscious is still incomplete, still unfolding, and that our greatest achievements and our deepest vulnerabilities both flow from the same incomplete inheritance. The book ends not with a triumphant declaration that the old mind is dead, but with the quiet, almost reverent acknowledgement that its vestiges remain woven into the fabric of everything we do, waiting for the right conditions to reappear, reminding us that consciousness was never meant to be the whole story of who we are. And so, Book 3 draws to its close, leaving us suspended between two worlds that are not really separate after all. The bicameral mind that once built the first cities and spoke with the authority of gods has not vanished. It has simply learned to wear new disguises, to speak in new languages, to surface when the conscious I needs relief, or when the world grows too chaotic for solitary narration. Jaynes has given us more than a theory of the past. He has handed us a mirror in which the present becomes suddenly transparent. Every time we look for a leader to tell us what is right, every time a poem or a song moves us beyond words, every time a voice inside or outside seems to command without debate, we are hearing the faint but unmistakable echo of that older mind. The revelation is not that we are broken remnants of something ancient. The revelation is that we are still whole, still carrying both mentalities inside us, still capable of the automatic certainty that once governed empires and the reflective freedom that now governs our search for meaning. In that double inheritance lies both the tension and the astonishing potential of what it means to be human today. And the story, like the mind itself, continues.